Good afternoon. My name is Tina Kepi, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. Lectures are held on the third Thursday of every month in room 303 in the City County Building at 555 South 10th Street in Lincoln. A detailed schedule of the series, as well as information about all of the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television and on our YouTube page. Today's speaker is Jeff Barnes. Barnes is a fifth-generation Nebraskan, the great-great-grandson of a Sandhills newspaper publisher and editor. A former newspaper reporter and editor himself, Barnes is the author of Forts of the Northern Plains, The Great Plains Guide to Custard, The Great Plains Guide to Buffalo Bill, and Extra Innings, The Story of Modisett Ballpark. Barnes is a trustee of the Nebraska State Historical Society, past chairman of the Nebraska Hall of Fame Commission, one of the 5 most requested presenters with Humanities Nebraska, and he has visited and photographed all 93 Nebraska county courthouses in the past 3 years. He and his wife Susan make their home in Omaha. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Barnes.
Yeah, I had to work that last one, and that was the hardest thing to do, was visit all 93 counties. But you do a lot of traveling in this kind of work. So I did want to recognize some folks real quickly before getting started on this. Of course, we got a contingent here from Rushville, Nebraska, so I'm pretty excited for that, to have that happen here as well. And also my favorite teacher from high school, Jerry Larson, is here. He's the one that really made me appreciate the written word more than anybody. So I really thank Jerry for being here today. And I also wanted to recognize Tom Beaker. Of course, many of you know Tom was with the Historical Society for many years and passed away unexpectedly earlier this year. And he was a great asset to historians that want to learn more about Nebraska. I met him about 10 years ago, and just always went over backwards to help me in anything I was working on. And he's the one that invited me here to present, of course, for today. And I'm really sorry not to have him here today. So did want to recognize Tom for that. Anyway, today's presentation, Sandhills and Sandlots. A little bit of background on this. I was hired about a year and a month ago to write a history of the Modisett Ballpark in Rushville. Former publisher of the World Herald, John Gottschalk, is a native of Rushville, and he was leading a reconstruction of the park, and through mutual friend asked me to put together a history of that. And I thought this would be kind of a quick and easy sort of thing to do and not that difficult to round up, but the more I got into it, the more fascinated I became with what had happened in Rushville and what was happening in Rushville. And by the time I was over with it, I said, this is a story I have to share with Nebraskans, not just those who love baseball, but love the history of the Sandhills and the people who helped create it, and their love of the game of baseball. It just it turned into something I thought was really kind of amazing that you wouldn't find in any other town in America. And that's why I proposed it to Humanities Nebraska and proposed it to the Historical Society for presentation today. And I really appreciate their letting me be here to talk about this. Now, a lot of folks always want to know, where is Rushville, Nebraska? Not everybody has heard of Rushville. That's one of the 93 county seats that I was able to visit in the last 3 years. But Rushville is located in the western part of Nebraska, in the northeast corner of the Panhandle, and it's the county seat of Sheridan County. And it started out as kind of a watering stop along the rails to the Black Hills. And this is a map from about 1885, I believe. So you see a number of communities and post offices that are no longer there. But Rushville is the county seat of Sheridan County. And this is one of the earliest photographs of the town. As I mentioned, started off as a watering spot along the rails. And very quickly, as most towns in America did, embrace the sport of baseball. And, typically, towns like this, you're more likely to see, or just as likely to see a cowboy hat as a baseball cap on those who played the game. And got to be very competitive with the surrounding communities as well. In digging into the archives of the Nebraska State Historical Society, the earliest reference I found to baseball came in 1885 in this little story in the Rushville Standard, which reported that the baseball club from Gordon made a sudden visit to Rushville, possessed themselves of our scalps, and departed with light hearts. The return game will not be played this season. So, but Rushville is very, very competitive. They weren't about to let one loss to a neighboring town get them down. So by the turn of the century, this photograph from 1901, they were pretty well organized. They had uniforms, and they even had a mascot. I'd like to know more about this little guy here, but I definitely would like to find out more about him. But they are very, very competitive, as I said, with the surrounding communities. Usually taking the rail to the next door neighbors, but from Rushville they departed for Clinton, Crawford, Gordon was a frequent opponent, Shadron, of course, Hay Springs, and quite often into the Pine Ridge Reservation where they played the Indian members of the tribe there. This is Rushville about 1915, and just as much as the players were competitive with each other, surrounding towns, the townspeople are fairly competitive with each other as well. I found a number of mentions in the newspapers and memoirs about games. If they weren't settled on the field, they got settled behind the grandstands afterwards. And there's also a story about couple ladies got into a fight with each other with some hair pulling and dress tearing and that sort of thing. But folks are really competitive about the game of baseball in Rushville, especially in the 1920s, and that's when Rushville, like many communities, would pay for players to have a competitive edge. And one of those who was brought to Rushville as a paid player was a young man originally from O'Neill, Nebraska, named Zhen Leahy. Zhen came from an Irish Catholic family there, and they were known for, I guess, their willingness to get into a fight when something was wrong and needed to be righted. Both he and his brother were very active in this. And by the way, his brother was Frank Leahy, one-time coach of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish football team, won 4 national championships. So really competitive guys. This is the kind of household that they grew up in. And Zhen, even as a young man himself, about 10 or 11, would organize baseball teams in O'Neill and borrow money from their folks and take the train to the next town where they'd play the boys there and then stay overnight in those boys' homes and then bring them back to O'Neill and play them there. So, I mean, he is already thinking, just, it's not enough to play in my own town. I got to go find some other kids to try to beat up on the field. But anyway, when he came out to the Panhandle, it was originally playing for Shadron, and as soon as they found out that Zhen was getting paid, the other players found out he was getting paid, which was a sum of $200 a month, which, as you can imagine, 1920s was quite a bit of money. That's a large amount of money. And when the other players found out that he was making this, they got pretty irate with him for that. And Zhen wanted to quit the team and move on, but the coach didn't want to do it. And Zhen warned him. He said, I told him if I stayed, I'd have to knock the hell out of some of them. So they cut Zhen free at that time. And he had played against Rushville before and played for them. It was kind of like a pickup game. And to have the opportunity to bring him to Rushville, that was an opportunity that they didn't want to miss. So he started in the town in the 1920s and began at the drugstore as a pharmacist. He had a pharmacy degree from Creighton University, and that's kind of how it worked back then. You'd have a full-time job that gave you a little bit of freedom to go play baseball. Both were very important to the community, so that's how he was funded to be in Rushville, Nebraska. And this is the Blankenbiller drugstore where he worked at on Main Street. Among the other players besides Zhen was a young man named Zhen Meyer. He played first base. Spectacular player, and had kind of a sense of humor too. There was a story from Zhen about a team from Sioux Falls traveling to Denver to play in what's the equivalent of the AAA World Series at the time. And they stopped in Rushville to just have a quick pickup game and, maybe kind of loosen up the elbows a bit. Well, Rushville was beating them pretty bad. They thought they'd take advantage of the little town, and that didn't happen. So, in fact, he played first base, and one of the runners from Sioux Falls who did make it to base was just kind of mumbling under his breath. He says, "You bunch of farmers, we'd like to stick around for another day and play you for a side bet of about $500. And Lee says, "Oh, we couldn't possibly play tomorrow. We have to go cultivate corn." So, real dry sense of humor. Another one was Roy Curtis, rose to prominence later on in the construction of the Modisett Ballpark, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But you notice from these photographs, you see the name Seals on the jerseys here, and you start to think about, okay, Rushville, Nebraska, it's on the edge of the sand hills in the Panhandle. Where the heck are you going to see seals in western Nebraska? Well, this actually, these are kind of hand-me-down uniforms from the San Francisco Seals, which was the AAA ball club at the time. And Gene's connection with a friend at the University of Nebraska who had a connection with the Seals in the San Francisco, they were updating their uniforms, and they had these old ones, and that's typically what happened. If they could have a place to sell their old ones, that's what they did. And so they sold everything but the shoes, cap down to stockings for $10 a uniform, which, again, as you can imagine, is quite a bit of money, but these are pretty substantial uniforms. And the Rushville team, variously known as the Capitals or the Outlaws or the Sluggers, they took on the name Seals. And you say, why would they do that? So, well, you got the name Seals on there. Are you going to strip off all those letters, cut out new letters, sew those onto there, and keep calling yourselves the Sluggers? Or are you just going to change your name to the Seals? Be a lot easier to change your name to the Seals. And there's kind of the professional ball panache about that as well. So that's how they got the name. Okay, next part of the story, the brothers Modisett and how they became involved in this. Albert and Mary Modisett were two brothers from Virginia. They're in the part of Virginia that broke off to form West Virginia after the Civil War. But they were from a very prominent family, very well-to-do. In fact, their mansion is somewhat of a tourist attraction now in Felipe, West Virginia, if you want to see that. But Albert had the idea to come out west in the 1880s and brought his brother with him, and they were off on a cattle drive from Texas up to Montana. And after Mary went back, Albert stuck around and ranched for a year in Montana and decided that this was the life for him. He really enjoyed his time ranching, and he thought back to his time passing through the sandhills of Nebraska and had just fallen in love with the country and decided to take out a claim and wrote back to his family. Let's see where we got it here. I have my own good land with good water that cooked my beans more tender than any other place I've been. Come, Albert. And so that's what brought his family out, in addition to Mary, which is a family name. That's not a name you typically see with a guy, but also brought his mother Nancy and his sister Rosa and his sister Ava. And Ava was around for about a year and decided the Sandhills life, ranching life, wasn't really for her, so she went back to West Virginia, but the rest of the family stuck around. And one thing that you did, if you took out a claim on a section of land, you had to homestead this. Well, what the Modisetts did, very, very smart, they settled their homestead right on the line between the sections that they were claiming. So a couple sections, one homestead. That's how you do that. But they were very, especially Albert, very, very advanced ranchers. They never overgrazed the land. They always were very good stewards of the land. In times of drought, they would cut back on the herds. In times of plenty, they'd expand the herds. And they took on the knowledge of what ranching was all about very, very quickly. In fact, they started to take over more ranches nearby. A lot of folks found out that ranching wasn't as easy as they thought it could be, and ended up selling their herds to the Modisett brothers. So what started out with just a carload of cattle going off to Omaha on the train would turn into soon a whole trainload of cattle coming from the Modisetts. This is their homestead, the ranch home at the Modisett place, fairly substantial. And this is the whole ranch stead there. typically, when they also bought out the neighboring ranches, they would also pick up the buildings that were there and move them to the Modisett ranch. They became bunkhouses for cowboys that they would hire. So they had, I think, at one point about 30 buildings altogether. So it's kind of like a small town out in the Sandhills. About the turn of the century, Mary decided he wanted to get into banking, so he sold out his share of the ranch operations to Albert and helped establish what became the Stockmen's National Bank in Rushville. That really turned the Modisett family into financial juggernauts of Sheridan County. They're not only into cattle and the ranching, but they're also now doing loans and mortgages and things like that. So really made them kind of a force to reckon with in town. Very, very strong stewards of money either. They didn't share too much of that. That was they had kind of a reputation for being stingy. In fact, Mari Sandoz referred to them in her book Old Jewels and talked about the stingy Modisett brothers. This is the barn at the ranch here. There you see the familiar double half circle brand that everybody in the county knew. And if you can't see who Albert is right away, I'll point him out here. He's the fellow wearing the tie. He had the starched shirt and the button cuffs and everything like that. He never gave up his genteel upbringing. He brought that with him to Rushville. And there's a story about, everybody in this room, I'm guessing, at one point has crossed a barbed wire fence. You don't think there's really a graceful way to do it. Well, there really isn't typically, but there's a group of ranchers and Albert who would come across a barbed wire fence, and everybody's trying to make their climb and everything go between the lines and everything. He would find a spot where there weren't any sandburrs and just lay his hat on one side and just lay down on the ground with his arms to his side and just roll neatly under the fence and stood up and brushed himself off. That's kind of the way he was. That's how he treated everything. Very, very advanced, too. I think he probably had the first airplane, biplane in the Sandhills. I mean, if there's a way to improve and bring the most to ranching that he could, I mean, they were the first to have electricity in that part of the Sandhills. He actually had constructed 2 roads between Rushville and the ranch, one for horse-drawn carriages, one for motorized vehicles. So that's 22 miles, so that's 44 miles of roads that he constructed just for that. As I mentioned, they knew the Mari Sandoz. Great friends, despite what she had said about them in Old Jewels. But she was once an associate editor of the Nebraska State Historical Society, Nebraska History Quarterly. And when she had written Old Jewels and started to pick up some fame, he would always clip out articles that he had seen and forward them on to her. And whenever he was in Lincoln, they would meet for coffee and lunch at the Hotel Cornhusker, which I'm sure most folks in this room probably remember as well. And this is a copy of one of the letters he wrote to her when he was on the road. It starts off, "My dear Maria." He always called her Maria. That's kind of, again, their enduring friendship. Very, very proud of her. Okay, now, Modisetts and baseball, how do they get together? Well, this goes back to the 1920s, and you see a couple of landmarks that I've already pointed out here. You see the Blankenbeller drugstore to the left, and then in the center, the Stockmen's National Bank. Well, it was one day at the drugstore that Gene Leahy was at a table, and he was making out a list of businesses in town that he was going to ask for money to help buy new uniforms. This is one of the things that he had to do as fundraising for the team. So he was going down the list of people that he would ask for money. Not on that list, of course, were the Modisetts, who did not give money away. Just don't even bother with that. Well, he's making this list, and then who should walk in but Mary Modisett, who notices him over at the table and comes over and says, "Mary, what's that you're doing?" Or excuse me, Gene, what's that you're doing there? And he says, "Well, I'm making a list of businesses to ask for money." And Mary says, "Well, whoever your top donor is, I'll match that." And it completely floored Leahy, because you don't ask the Modisetts for money, and here he is coming up out of the blue, "Whatever you need, we've got it." So How that turned out was that it made the Modisett brothers, particularly Mary, a great fan of Rushville baseball, and they were always there to help support the team. Mary would accompany the team quite frequently to away games, and of course was at all the home games, and a big supporter of Leahy. They became lifelong friends as a result of this beginnings that they had here. Things started to change very quickly, however, in 1935, and that's when the Modisett brothers had gone back to visit family in West Virginia, and on the way back, their car was struck by a freight train at the Indiana-Ohio border. Now, Mary survived the accident, came away after about 2 hours in the hospital, but Albert, unfortunately, was killed immediately at the site of the collision. And of course dominated the news in Sheridan County, but it also changed the future of the town of Rushville for many, many years. Mary was responsible for the execution of the will of Albert, and after family had been taken care of and friends and employees and that sort of thing, that's when the generosity of the Modisett brothers started to show up in the community of Rushville. Part of his will provided for the construction of a city hall and swimming pool that you see here with Modisett Hall. It included a new airfield for Rushville, a new library for the community, Modisett Club. This is where the retired gentlemen could go play cards and not have to be bothered with that. They funded a new cemetery for the community. This is the Modisett family plot here. They even convinced their sister Rosa to contribute for a new public restroom, ladies' room for downtown Rushville. That's not something you typically hear about. Well, remember, Rushville is a ranching community, and typically Saturday night is when everybody comes into town for a good time, and you don't want the ladies to have to go to the bars and other places to use the restroom. So this was constructed for their convenience. They actually had a full-time attendant living in the apartment on the second floor there, and also contributed for the establishment of the Modisett Park in Rushville. And immediately adjacent to that was a new ball field. The field went up first. This was in 1939, but Mary decided he didn't want to wait until he was gone to see that come to its full fruition. And so that's when he authorized the construction of the Grandstand at Modisett Ballpark. And here's the headlines for when that was first announced that was going to be constructed. This is in 1940. And the first game they had scheduled was for September 8th of 1940. This was a game between the Coors Brewers, this is the Colorado State champions, and the semi-pro champions of Nebraska from Ogallala. And Coors beat Ogallala that night, but it kind of an inauspicious beginning. Right about the time the game started, this huge dust storm came up out of the northwest. And this is, the grandstand faces towards the northwest, so these poor folks, this field wasn't sodded yet or anything, so for most of the game, they were getting beat down by the dust coming through, but Mary provided for sodding for the field for next year. Now we come to the chapter that's almost unbelievable, and that's the establishment of the Rushville Baseball School. By the 1950s, Rushville no longer had a standing ball team. The field was used for community events, community play, and that sort of thing with the youth. But in 1953, Gene Leahy, who is now retired as a pharmacist and gone into insurance sales full-time. His health wouldn't allow him to stand for continued periods of time, but he was at a game in Waterloo, Nebraska, with a scout from the Milwaukee Braves, Eddie Danzizek. He was the chief Midwestern scout. And they were at the Douglas County Fair scouting out a player that was a possible prospect for the Braves. And Leahy was a big sports fanatic, as you can imagine, so he was there to help scout out the talent. And during a lull in the action, Danzizek happened to ask him, what's going on in Rushville? Tell me a little bit about your town. And Gene did, and got to the point talking about the baseball field. And he says, we probably have the best ball field in western Nebraska. It's just a shame we don't have a team to play on it. And Danzizek said, well, how would you like a baseball school there? And that just flabbergasted Gene. He says, a baseball school in Rushville, Nebraska? Yeah, why not? And thought, well, okay, let's do this. Keep in mind, Rushville at the time was about 1,200 people. And this particular year of 1954, the Braves were only going to be hosting one baseball school, and that was going to be in Rushville, Nebraska. They typically have them around the country, so it was going to be in town this year. Then and now, Rushville doesn't have a lot of lodging opportunities. And if you're going to have at least 100 boys coming to town, plus all these scouts and coaches for the Milwaukee Braves and maybe some media and everything, where are you going to put them all? And that's what brought Gene back to his childhood. And he thought of when he was a boy and organized those teams in O'Neill. The boys would go from town to town and stay overnight at the other ball players' homes, and he'd do the same in O'Neill. So he thought, what if the town of Rushville opened up its homes to all of these boys and scouts and players coming to Rushville? Could we do that again? And amazingly, the town opened up for it. It's a good thing, too, because they're hoping to get 100 boys. They ended up getting 200 boys to show up for the baseball school in Rushville. And just overwhelming. It was just a fantastic event. Gene converted his insurance agency to the headquarters of the baseball school. They did this not only for 54, but they were doing it for the next 7 years altogether. This is where boys would come in and sign up and register. You might recognize your sister there. Connie Holstein's sister is right, Connie's right there. Her sister's with us today as well. And this is Bill Barnes, no relation, but he's John Gottschalk's grandfather. He owned the newspaper at the time in Rushville. But these are the boys getting signed up for the baseball school. And this was unlike a tryout camp. You know, tryout camps, you'd show your paces to the scouts and they'd cut you or say, we'll talk some more or whatever. Any boy that showed up for this, they would not be cut. They would get the whole benefit of the baseball school. So they would learn the best ways to take a base, to hit, to catch, to field, everything involved in becoming a better baseball player. So it's really worth their time if they wanted to do more with baseball, to spend the time here in Rushville for that. And at the culmination of the 3 days, there would be an all-star game on Sunday, held between who were determined to be the best ball players from the school against the best semi-pro team in the state at the time, which happened to be from North Platte that year. And it was a phenomenal success. The Braves actually even signed a boy from Nebraska to a contract out of the first baseball school in Rushville. And this was Dale Hendrickson, who was a southpaw from Gering, Nebraska. He didn't even play in the All-Star game. They had just seen him warming up a little bit, and I think he already had a reputation in Nebraska as well, so they did sign him into a contract. And started out with the team in Lawton, Oklahoma, and I guess he just tore up all the records for pitching in Oklahoma that year. There's a typical headline that you saw from the newspapers of the time. And went on, I think played 6 different levels with the Braves that year. He was with his career with them. Played in Lawton, Evansville, Jacksonville, Atlanta. Trying to think of another time. This is he with Evanston. His catcher happened to be Bob Uecker. Remember Bob Uecker from commercials? Less filling tastes great. Real comedian. They'd go to a restaurant and order a steak, and Uecker would just pick up the steak and tear into it like a caveman or something like that. And he had fake vomit in his pocket that he'd pretend to get sick right in front of the waitress, and just a real comedian. But Bill Hendrickson actually did play he played every level except with the Braves themselves, but he did go to the spring training where he had the opportunity to pitch against the New York Yankees, and that's what brought this headline back to Nebraska. Hendrickson strikes out Mantle and Berra, which is pretty good for a kid from Nebraska. I mean, it was huge news, not just in Rushville and Gering, but across the state. It was just really exciting to have that happen for him. But anyway, it was a resounding success for Milwaukee Braves as well. This is a feature story in the Milwaukee Sentinel. They wrote a whole page about the Rushville baseball school. The town put up a billboard on the outside of the town advertising this is the home of the Milwaukee Braves annual school. Made a big story in Baseball Digest. Also made a big feature in Street and Smith's baseball yearbook. Just had really captured the fancy of the national baseball media, what was happening in this little town of 1,200 in the sandhills of Nebraska. In 1956, they made a little video of this, and you can go onto YouTube and see this as well, or go to the Modisettballpark.com website that we've set up, and you can see the video there. But they put together a film in 1956 that told the whole story about what happened, or what was happening in Rushville. And these are a few of the stills from that. There, of course, they had a parade downtown. There's the dedication of the monument in the park. There's Gene Leahy with his brother Frank, who came back as a speaker for the banquet there. Milwaukee Braves had their car for the, I think that's one of the dealers had outfitted that for the parade for the Braves there. This was kind of fun. The Miller Brewing Company sent a vehicle. It's a hospitality vehicle. It was kind of a souped up hearse ambulance sort of thing. But this would take dignitaries from the Alliance newspaper to Alliance Airport to Rushville. Acted as I said, a courtesy vehicle, but also a kind of a rolling PA system. You see the speakers and on the side here, the speakers on the side of this as well. This was designed by the guy that actually did the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile. This is one of his creations. But they sent that for a couple years to Rushville to help promote it. And, of course, in 1957, the Braves won the World Championship, which brought even more luster to Rushville, Nebraska, to have that association going on with them. So this is really a fine time to be from Rushville, Nebraska, and pick up a little fame with that. 1961, though, however, came to an end. This is the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Braves said that they wouldn't hold the school that year because it wouldn't really send the right image for boys that could be going to war to go play baseball instead. So there's some other things going on as well back in Milwaukee. Despite winning the World Series, the owner was getting a little bit tight about treatment of the fans, and the one thing that he had done was to ban outside beer from coming into the stadium at Milwaukee. And of course, Milwaukee's beer town. You can't tell people you can't bring your beer and watch a ball game. So that shut them off. So the fans started boycotting the games, and so the ownership retaliated by doing a blackout on the town so you couldn't watch the games on TV. So they got even more riled up, and finally the ownership threatened, I'll move it to Atlanta, and they said, yeah, right, and so he moved it to Atlanta. So that pretty much ended the connection with Rushville and Milwaukee, unfortunately. But filling in, the New York Yankees came for a year, hosted a baseball school there, and a couple of years after that, the Los Angeles Angels came to town, and there's manager with Joe Gordon with the Los Angeles Angels, and there's Gene to the right, and Bill Holstein, and your dad. There you go. He headed the Chamber of Commerce for most of the baseball school, so very, very, very involved with it. And I think your family held all the big names at your place, didn't you? Who did you host there?
Dan Sisek, Russ Sion, and then one year there was a contingency of men from South America.
Yeah, the Latin American. Yeah.
American, and we had them.
Yeah, so yeah, the Holsteins got all the big names. Well, I know your sister said that was a much coveted job to sign in the ball players, because I mean you had all these boys coming to see you. Anyway, the ballpark. Let's see. Once the baseball schools left, and teams were pretty much going to colleges and American Legion play to see the prospective players now. The baseball schools really didn't figure into that anymore, so that freed up the Modisett Ballpark for community events and where the youth would go to play. Among them was a young boy named Timothy Hagel. It was while playing ball at the Modisett Ballpark that he picked up the name from a coach that pretty much changed his name from that point on. Then he was known as Chuck Hagel, and of course went on to become U.S. Senator and Secretary of Defense. But it was at Modisett Ballpark that he got his name of Chuck. And it was also where a young boy named John Gottschalk, the grandson of the publisher of the newspaper, grew up to play baseball as well. Okay, now we get to another part, and this is one of the things I love about history, where you have these most seemingly insignificant events that kind of just trip into each other and just sends things off in a completely different direction. And that's kind of what happened in 1965. Gene Leahy was getting ready to close down his insurance agency and for retirement, and was going through some papers, and came across this box that included the film of the Modisett, or the Rushville story, as well as some other papers in his memoirs, and decided to go next door to it. He had his office adjoined the Rushville Journal-Star, and in there working this particular day was John Gottschalk, who was home for the summer helping his folks out and running the newspaper. So he brings over this box to John and says, I want you to have this. And John takes a look at it and says, well, this looks kind of important. Are you sure you want me to have it? And says, yes, absolutely, I want you to have it. He says, well, what am I supposed to do with it? I said, well, I don't know, but you'll figure it out someday. And so John held on to that. And after this, John went on to become a newspaper publisher himself, moved on to Sydney, where he bought the newspaper there, became the youngest mayor in Nebraska at the time. I think he was about 27 when he became mayor of Sydney. This is John at the dedication of the Golden Link on the U.S., on the Interstate 80 down there. Sold the newspapers, at that point joined the World Herald, became assistant to the president and then vice president, and then eventually chairman and publisher of the World Herald himself. And then with his retirement in 2008, he and his wife Carmen established the Carmen and John Gottschalk Foundation with a number of concerns what they're helping to support, in addition to helping out the town, their hometown of Rushville, whenever that would need help. And that's what happened in 2013 when he got a call from the mayor of Rushville asking for some help in fixing up the old grandstand. It was really turning into kind of an eyesore. The paint really needed repair. There's some minor repairs that needed to be made. And the mayor called John and said, would you mind helping us out? We're looking maybe about $2,000 for paint and some repairs. And John started thinking, he's remembered back to when Gene Leahy had given him that box of materials, and he said, I wonder if this is what Gene was talking about. I knew what to do someday. So he told the mayor, Chris, Bubba, said, stop what you're doing. I'll send you a check, but I'm going to be up there in about a week. We're going to go check this out and see what actually does need to be done. So he and an architect friend of his and an engineering friend of his from HDR Architecture in town, they flew up to Rushville and took a look around the ballpark and found about 43 different things that really needed to be addressed there. So he came up with the idea, let's do something more than just a coat of paint for this. What he had proposed was a $125,000 grant to the community if they could match that. I think he's actually doubling. It's in the book, the dollars and cents. That's why I write books, because I can't remember all this stuff. It's just easier to put it in print. But he was going to contribute substantially to the community if they could raise $100,000 for the rebuilding of Modisett Ballpark. And so a steering committee was formed for that. And in March of last year, this is what they're proposing for that with the ballpark. It's going to have new dugouts, new bleachers, new grandstand, batting cage, everything. That's what it's going to look like from the ground here. And this is some of the thermometers that they put up around town for the raising of the funds for that. And by the 1st of March of 2014, they actually did it. They actually exceeded it, I think, by about $12,000. So it ended up, I think the foundation contributed more than $350,000 to it, plus additional funding that came from other folks. And then things actually got kind of added more and more to that as well. This decision came to be, we're not just going to do this in dribs and drabs, replace the lighting this year and replace that next year, new grandstand at that time. It all got done last year. But here's John and the mayor signing the agreements for the reconstruction of the Modisett Ballpark. And that began with the stripping of the old grandstand. Most of the wood was salvaged. I think it was used to build a garage for a gentleman up in South Dakota. But then that got leveled. And this is kind of the phoenix rising from the ashes. What was left was burned there, and cleared away, and a new foundation for the grandstand going in. This is the foundation. The footings being set up for that. New infield went in. New watering system for that. New sod coming in. This is the grandstand going up and completion on that. And got everything done just barely by the 31st of August. And I had driven across the northern part of Nebraska to get there, and we had just gotten to Gordon and got hit by a huge hailstorm there. And I was thinking back to 75 years earlier when that dust storm hit the first grandstand on dedication day. Or this is actually 74 years earlier. And I thought, oh, the poor community, that just have another disaster there. But I got there, and the weather had all cleared up, and John Gottschalk was already there, and I told him I'd just come through a hailstorm, and he pointed up at the sky. Unbelievable. It was this beautiful rainbow just going from one horizon to the other, and I said, okay, this is a good day. This all turned around. And this is before the game. The grandstand did fill up here, but had a new concession stand there. All kinds of people for that. They had free hot dogs and free Cracker Jack and free Pepsi for the day. Souvenir balls and bats and caps were for that. Dedication of new memorial plaza to everybody who contributed, and in memory of those who had helped establish the original ballpark. This is the grandstand, of course, much more comfortable than the previous one had been. Dale Hendrickson was there. I had interviewed him a couple times for the book, but he was there for the dedication. This is the boy that was signed from the old baseball school. Of course, Jeannie and Connie were there. They were both tremendous helps in writing the book and telling the stories of what had happened back with the old ball school. Jeannie is the daughter, of course, of Gene Leahy. And John and Carmen were there for the dedication. John threw out the first pitch. I had asked him, I said, have you ever thrown a ball from the pitcher's mound before? And he says, no, never has. I said, you're probably going to wish you'd practiced. So the first pitch got about halfway there. And he said, I'm doing this again. Hang on. So he picked up, and I think the next pitch got about 3/4 of the way to the home plate. So, but it was all good fun. And then the teams from, I think it was Rushville Gordon against Shadron, and is it just Shad? I can't remember. But it's mostly between Rushville and Shadron. But they took the field, and the home team actually won that night. But of course, the singing of the national anthem there, new press box on top that they hadn't had before. Just a beautiful, beautiful grandstand. Oh, that's me at the end there. Didn't notice that. And then the players took the field, and it just turned out to be a beautiful night for baseball in Rushville, Nebraska. Although it did get a little bit colder as it went on. And you see a lot of cars in the outfield there. I think a lot of folks did end up parking out there as it got colder into the night. But that's pretty much how it turned out. I was just absolutely floored to be part of this experience, just to see the thing developing, and then at the same time to be finding out some of the stories that hadn't been heard before, hadn't been collected before. A good portion of it I got from the Sheridan County Historical Society, but also from Sister Connie and from Jeannie, Dale Hendrickson, and of course the Nebraska State Historical Society archives were tremendous in putting this together. But it turned out to be such a fun story of Nebraska baseball that I said other people have to hear this story. It's just truly, truly amazing. And I think that concludes the talk. Okay. Thank you folks very much. If we have time for questions, I'd be happy to take a couple. I saw a couple friends from the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation come in.
How common was it for towns pay a player in those days of town teams?
I think it was fairly common, especially if they were, the question was how frequently were these players paid to play for the town teams. I think it was fairly common, especially if you wanted to be competitive about it. I know from the stories that I'd read in the memoirs and some of the newspaper accounts that there's quite a bit of gambling going on at these. So I think the money filtered to where it needed to go to happen, and it was prime entertainment for the communities as well. I mean, you would easily get 1,000 people to a game, and this is kind of without grandstands as well. I mean, everybody had a really strong interest in that. So I'm guessing, probably every town of over 500 probably had somebody that was getting played to pay there, or otherwise they're probably just pretty much the whipping boys for the other teams. So, but it's kind of funny talking about that, how competitive they were. But Gene Leahy had in his memoirs, he was talking about playing in Gordon, I believe it was, and they had a big problem with out in the outfield, a lot of sandburrs and things like that, and getting caught up in the pant legs and the stockings and everything. And one of the players was certain that the Rushville team was doing something to the baseball because they were just too good. So said, "Let me see the baseball." And Gene had taken a couple of the sandburrs and stuck them to the baseball and said, "Here's the ball." Slammed it into the guy's hand. He had all kinds of stories like that. Just really didn't have a lot of respect for anybody that would question the thing. So I think Jeannie said she was looking at maybe reprinting his memoirs, which are hilarious. Just really something to read. He typed on, of course, old manual typewriter, and he was a 2-finger typer. And some of you remember, to make an exclamation point back then, you had to hit the apostrophe and then backspace and hit the period. And he didn't have time for that. I can't remember what symbol he used instead, but he used a question mark instead. And I said, "Why is he questioning everything he says?" And then I realized, oh, those are exclamation points. I mean, they typically had 4 or 5 question marks after every other sentence. So he was very, very emphatic about his beliefs. So. Okay. Well, thank you very much. If you are interested in the copy of the book, I know they do have it at the gift shop at the Capitol building. I can't remember. There's a hardcover version and there's a softcover version. The softcover is $10 and the hardcover is $15 if you're interested. But I don't know if anybody brought one. I know can't sell to here. Well, see me afterwards if you're interested. So, okay. Thanks very much, folks. I appreciate it.